Welcome back, everyone, or if you're here for the first time, then welcome. This is the Yiddish Ecologies conference. Hopefully you're in the right room. I'm very happy to have you all here. Mindel gave a beautiful paper with a description of things getting overrun with mosses, but unfortunately Ken Moss couldn't be here today. So
Nicely
I know,
done.
I was waiting for that one the whole time.
Definitely the first time anyone's made it.
So you have me instead. I'm Jessica Kirzane, and I'm very happy to be moderating this panel about ecological history. I'll just say the names of the three presenters and their papers. I won't give you the whole bio because you have that in your program. And we'll just have the three papers one after the other and do questions and answers at the end. If you are joining us online, then you can raise your hand about having a question, and then we will take those questions as well through the Zoom at the end after all three panelists have had an opportunity to present. So we will be joined first by Caleb Sher, whose paper is titled Gemores and Geviksn, Writing Yiddish Nature Education with Avrom Golomb. Cecile Kuznitz, who will be giving a paper on building Doikeyt through engagement with nature, the example of Vilna. And Pollin-Galay, who will be giving a paper titled Forced Outside of Nature, Yiddish Ecopoetry of the Holocaust. So we'll begin with Felder.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me for this talk. It'll be fun, I promise. There'll be pictures of frogs and plants and all sorts of fun things like that. Just before I get started, a huge thank you to all of the organizers who have brought together this wonderful conference. I've already learned a ton in our first panel. It's already made me rethink some of what I've been thinking about these texts. So very excited to think further with all of you. So without further ado, in an article published in Krakow's Der Jud, dated the 7th of June, 1900, writer and critic Reuven Breinen poses the following question to his readers. And please excuse the Deutschsprech. Was sollen unsere Kinder lesen? Though Breinen's argument will go on to rest on a somewhat comically masculic assumption that Jewish children can really only ever learn through the form of the book, nevertheless, his argument resonates in its deeper claim that if one wants to build a secular modern Yiddish culture, one needs secular modern Yiddish literature on which to raise one's children. So today I want to introduce you to one such effort to answer this civilizational challenge, the early biobotanical writings of the essayist and pedagogue Avrom Golomb. We're going to skip this bit, just a few of the kind of ridiculous arguments that Breinen gives in his article. Here's Mr. Golomb himself. Well, we briefly touch on some of the more practical texts which Golomb wrote, translated or edited in contribution to what I've been thinking of as a specifically Yiddish language biology curriculum. My primary focus today will be on two short texts he published first in 1918 with the intriguing titles Das erste Mal in Wald, My First Trip into the Woods, and Wie von a Fisch is a Frosch geworden, How a Fish Becomes a Frog. I will examine how these texts blend genre and bring together Jewish tradition with secular modernity. And I think despite the, for lack of a better term, strangeness of these texts, it is my contention that they still fit neatly into Golomb's project to develop curricular material for a Yiddish language biology course, and that moreover, they define his answer to Breinen's challenge of what Jewish children should be reading. So interwoven throughout his life and writing was his commitment to the study of the natural world. Early in his career, in the late teens and early 20s of the previous century, Golomb wrote several books on biology and botany, including textbooks, botanical dictionaries, and laboratory manuals for both students and teachers. To take one example, let's take a look at what is probably his most influential botanical work, simply titled Geviksn, or Plants. Golomb writes in the introduction to the first edition of this text that while it is a translation of a Polish work titled Rośliny, excuse my pronunciation, by one J. Boch, it has been reworked, and as much as possible, terminology in it has been taken from what he calls the Volkssprache, here obviously Yiddish. More to the point, though, in the introduction to this text in the first edition and in later editions, as well as his experiment handbooks, textbooks on water plants, laboratory guides, and other things he's publishing at the time, Golomb insists that these are specifically not books to be studied, but rather tools to study one's object. That is, in his words, one ought not teach this book, but with its help teach nature. Nevertheless, Golomb's textual output in his early years didn't exclusively consist of reference works or laboratory guides, loosely put, practical texts. In fact, the two texts I will focus on today are really quite different. Exactly what these are is an unsettled matter. On the one hand, both books carry the subtitle, you can maybe see there, Zichronos von mein Kindheit, that is memories from my childhood. So they are in some sense memoiristic. I hesitate to call them simply memoirs, since I have reason to believe that the stories are at least in part, if not mostly, fabricated. On the other hand, the two books form a series called the Naturwissenschaftliche Erzählungen, part of the Bialystok Kulturliga's 1921 Bibliothek series. It's worth noting that the 1921 editions from that I'm working from are second editions, having both first been published in Kiev in 1918, where Golomb was actually living at the time and was really quite actively involved in the Kulturliga movement there. I have unfortunately yet to be able to track down extant copies of the first edition, so if anyone knows where they may be, please tell me. But nevertheless, Golomb's bibliography notes that the first editions were published as part of a similar series called Der Erzählungen für Kinder, which strikes a very similar note to the 1921 Bibliothek. So we might also read these texts as children's literature. Admittedly, they are rather text-heavy, but they do contain a number of illustrations, as we'll see. And it's always good to remember the great Dina Abramovich's advice that when considering Yiddish children's literature, we ought to take seriously the oft-repeated refrain from the 19th century and beyond. These are books written for readers gross and clean, that is, young and old. So I contend that these texts are both, that is, they are both memoir of childhood and fiction for children. They are ambiguous texts, texts that mix genre, style, and form. And what I am further proposing today is how this ambiguity fits them into the constellation of Yiddish language, botanical, pedagogical materials with which Golomb concerned himself in the early 20th century. These books are, in fact, books to be studied. And at the same time, it is the textual study of these books which set the stage for going beyond the text and into the physical or natural world. So in broad strokes, both texts have the same plot structure. At the beginning, our narrator, Berg, and his friend or cousin, it varies depending on the text, Elzik, are sitting in the best midrash with open Gemores in front of them, pretending to study while their elderly teacher takes a lengthy nap in the back room. I just want to note here, this figure of the absent teacher is plainly a plot device standing in for the absence of learning in a traditional shtetl education. This is one of these moments where I have reason to doubt the veracity of these texts. Golomb writes quite fondly of his best midrash teacher in his, what is more, explicitly a memoir that he writes later in the 60s, and a very different figure from the figure we have in these texts. Nevertheless, unsurprisingly, Berg and Elzik get rather bored, and so they abandon their Gemores, leave the best midrash, and go play in the mud. Adventure ensues, their shoes are muddied, fish are caught. The crux of both books is really that the boys, in what I want to resist reading as merely a stereotype of the failures of shtetl education, though it certainly is in some part that too, encounter the world beyond the boundaries of the best midrash and the shtetl at large as a foreign entity, full of critters and creatures which not only they don't understand, but more significantly, they cannot even name. So in the end, they return home weary and a little bit frightened by their adventures, but similarly full of new knowledge, wonder and curiosity, which leaves them totally unsated and longing for more. So on the surface, these texts seem awfully simplistic. A pattern begins to emerge. Jewish boys know nothing about nature. Jewish boys leave the best midrash. Jewish boys learn something about nature. And I think I could just as easily have replaced nature here with broader notions of modernity or secular knowledge, and the point still stands. It is, I think you'll agree, a bit of a stale trope. Yet, as I began to elaborate above, I am reading these texts somewhat against the grain of the superficial conflict between Jewish tradition and secular modernity, which they seem at first to be rehearsing. Recall that they are structurally somewhat ambiguous, being both a piece of short fiction for really middle grade readers or younger readers, and at the same time some kind of memoir or autofiction of Golomb's childhood. To which I also want to add a third ambiguity. They also take on the role of a sort of textbook, or at least a non-fictional popular science book. So take, for example, the insertion of explanatory footnotes, whether to define the Yiddish name of a plant by its Russian counterpart, Golomb was a Russian speaker, or to explain the various root systems of various water plants in some detail. And while some of the illustrations are simply decorative, others like these have a clearly pedagogical value, such as these ones comparing the development of frog row versus toad row in particular from Even a Fish. There are also significant moments in both texts where Golomb's authorial voice slips, that is, where his ich seems to abandon the narratorial voice of Berg and briefly inhabit what I've been thinking of as a pedagogical or declamatory voice of the grown-up Golomb, the teacher. Now, I can't say with certainty whether or not these books would actually have been used in a classroom, but nevertheless, as Nathan Cohen has demonstrated in his recent article in Judaical Librarianship, this phenomenon of Bibliotheken, like the Kulturliga's 1921 series, also known as, quote, libraries without walls, in the words of the French historian of the book, Roger Chartier, was widespread in early 20th century Yiddish-speaking Eastern Europe. These were serial publications unified by the goal not only of popular entertainment, though they often sought to distinguish themselves from shunt publications, but also, more importantly, public enlightenment. So this framework, I think, of Libraries Without Walls enables us to read Golomb's text as a sort of juvenile nonfiction, intended, if not for the classroom, then certainly for the purposes of popular education. So they are structurally ambiguous, inhabiting multiple genres. Moreover, though, the texts are both substantially ambiguous. That is, the superficial simplicity of their plots belies a more robust attempt to tackle the question of Yiddish modernity and the tensions between Jewish tradition and secular knowledge. To explore this further, I want to examine the central setting of each text and the ways in which those spaces facilitate learning for Berl and Elzig. In Das erste Mal im Wald, the woods, unsurprisingly, and in Wie von der Fisch, the Shtetl pond. Both are what you might call wild spaces, yet significantly, they are also both spaces that are liminal to the shtetl. And here I actually do want to give a huge thank you to Mindel, who when I gave a version of this paper at AJS 2 years ago, suggested that I think through liminality a bit further with regards to these texts and the spaces they depict. Okay, so I'll start with Berl, who at the beginning of Das erste Mal im Wald is sitting, staring out the window of the Best Midrash, utterly bored out of his mind. His eyes wander to a tree. The middle tree, which is taller than all the others, with short branches slanting upwards, pointy at the top, looking like a sugar loaf on a thin leg. It was probably a poplar tree, but as a kid, I didn't know that there were all sorts of different kinds of trees, each with their own names. So this motif of sort of nominative ignorance recurs regularly throughout both texts, often taking this exact form of a naive description of a creature or plant, accompanied by backwards projected knowledge from the voice of Lehrer or teacher Golomb. Berl then quickly notices that a bird has flown onto the scene, a bird he does not recognize, and flits its way through the branches before zipping off back to the forest. He runs to tell his buddy Elzig, their tumult wakes the Malamed, soon enough it's time for Mincha, and the whole minyan is engaged in discussion of this wondrous bird. With each telling, it gets bigger, more colorful, and less believable, until they've convinced themselves that they've seen an oirhon, which could mean a grouse, but could also mean the type of bird that is supposed to have helped King Solomon in building the temple, and supposedly is a sign of the coming of Mashiach. So this excitement, though, is quickly deflated by the arrival of Velder, a Jew who, by profession, manages the non-Jewish loggers on behalf of the shtetl's cottage logging industry. Velder is described as follows. Velder spent most of his time in the woods, rarely coming home. But today he had a yortzeit to mark, and so he came to say Kaddish. The scent of wood followed him everywhere. After drawing out a description of the bird and its actions from Berl, Velder, breaks all the fun up by concluding that we call that a woodpecker. What? Well, there are no woodpeckers in your Gemara? I want to know two things. First, that there are two systems of knowledge represented here to dispel Berl's ignorance. The first is the religious or mythic understanding of the bird as a sign of Mashiach. I think it's significant that despite the figure of the absent Malamed and thus the absence of Jewish learning looming over both of these texts, Golomb still manages to represent a Jewish understanding as a positive system of knowledge rather than merely a continuation of Berl's lack. The second, of course, is a secular understanding of the bird for what it, quote, actually is, which Golomb represents as being derived from a description of the bird's morphology and its actions within an ecosystem. Of further interest here is the figure of Velder himself, the keeper of this, so-called correct knowledge of this mysterious bird. Velder is a liminal Jew, that is, someone who lives primarily outside the bounds of Jewish community, and as we will see shortly, primarily among non-Jews, and who only returns to the community to partake in the bare minimum of Jewish tradition, here saying Kaddish. What's more, his arrival in the Best Midrash has transported the woods, that is, its scent, a physical manifestation of the natural world, into the bounds of the shtetl. His presence has therefore blurred the boundary between inside and out. So in short, Berl and Elzig's curiosity is piqued, and they convince Velder's son, Shimik, to take them on an adventure in the woods so they can see the woodpecker again. I want to focus on one scene in particular. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to skip through this. These are just a sampling of the terms that Golomb has peppered throughout this text. One of the significant goals that he tries to accomplish with both of these texts is basically a vocabulary lesson and to situate Yiddish vocabulary, Yiddish natural vocabulary in what is simultaneously a naturalistic environment and also what you might call a Yiddishistic environment. One of the most striking moments of learning, which occurs in Das erste Mal im Wald, is when the boys, having come across Velder's logging camp, convince one of his non-Jewish employees to show them a woodpecker's nest. A bit of background for this scene. The unnamed logger is just 2 pages earlier described as speaking a jumbled, quote, Goyishin Yiddish, yet the actual lesson about the woodpecker's nest takes place in a fluent Yiddish textually, thus one has to assume in a co-territorial language diegetically. After being shown the nest and encouraged to climb the tree and take a look directly inside it, Shimmick asked the logger if he would help them trap a woodpecker so they could bring it back to the shtetl to show off to all their friends, and the logger, in no uncertain term, replies, "No, that's forbidden. You don't kill woodpeckers. Woodpeckers are good birds. They eat flies and worms and other critters that hurt the trees. Why do you think it pecks, huh? Just because? No, it's looking for food. And what a tongue it has for looking for food. Just as it should be. Thin, long, and round like an awl. It's bendy too, like a worm. The woodpecker can stick its tongue into every little hole under the bark and pull out something meaty. And that's how it saves the trees. Yes, it's a good bird, and so you don't hurt it." So the forest becomes a sort of classroom in which a lesson whose scope is both ecological and evolutionary, and whose audience is as much Berl, Eltzik, and Shimmick as it is the reader, is eloquently declaimed not by a rabbi, fast asleep as he is, but by a working class non-Jewish logger. Throughout the text, the forest begins to encroach on the shtetl and the shtetl on the forest. Boundaries blur in this liminal space between Jewish civilization and the wider natural world, which here is populated by pedagogically inclined non-Jewish loggers who take a break from sawing trees and smoking machorka, which is mentioned several times in the text, to help create a space for a specifically Yiddish understanding of nature. Moving on then. At the beginning of Wie von der Fisch is a Frosch geworden, we pick up with Berl and Eltzik, who again are bored with their Gemora and their Napron Malamed. Eltzik thus hashes a plan. They should build an aquarium, like one he's seen in a neighbor's window, hide it in the Best Midrash attic, and fill it with fish from the shtetl pond so they can play with them. I'm going to skip forward just a little bit past some of this. Nevertheless, needless to say, the boys go out, they build their aquarium, they fill it with plants, they get the fish, they bring them into the attic, some time passes, and their excitement begins to grow as the fish begin to grow and metamorphize. What we thought was the head became too big, too wide. The mouth, on the other hand, was too small. The tail remained too thin and too clearly separated from the head. It was dark in the middle, but at the top and bottom, its skin was transparent and shiny, like glasses frames. In other words, nothing like a fish. So Berl is then bedridden for a few weeks with a nasty flu, rather conveniently, and he returns to the Best Midrash a couple of weeks later to find that where once their fish lived happily in their aquarium, now lives only a frog. That most terrible of water-dwelling creatures, which per the folklore of the shtetl youth, Eltzik reports in hysterics, curses you with its unnatural croaking. Have you seen how it croaks and curses? Everyone says frogs croak curses. Eltzik is furious with them, accusing him of having drawn him into a terrible conspiracy. Get out of here with your fish. You made it all up. There never were fish in that jar. But a gilgul in the Best Midrash. So again, the boys have worked themselves up into a folkloric or mythic frenzy. Admittedly, this time around, it is much more childish and doesn't involve the whole minyan, the gabbai, and the malamed. Nevertheless, it is still a representation of a positive state of folkloric understanding, if of course incorrect. So I want to focus on one image in particular. Before all hell breaks loose and frogs are leaping through the Beis Midrash rafters, Golomb describes how the boys are ever so careful while bringing their new aquarium up to the attic. We entered the Beis Midrash overjoyed. Holding our aquarium ever so carefully, God forbid we should let a single drop fall. We covered it with our coats so that nobody could see what we were carrying. Of course, they don't want to leave a trail and get caught. Yet subtextually, they are attempting to keep these two very different worlds of the pond and the Beis Midrash apart, having been admonished earlier in the text for the very, quote, un-Jewish activity of playing in the mud. Nevertheless, their care to keep these two worlds apart notwithstanding, by crossing the threshold of the Beis Midrash with their fish, they have punched a figurative hole into the boundary between religious study and biological knowledge. They have quite literally brought the shtetl pond into the realm of Torah study. In fact, throughout the text leading up to the flood of frogs into the Beis Midrash floorboards, we as readers are given a similarly sort of leaky boundary, a small, slow stream of biological knowledge to supplement the folk religious understanding of the natural and supernatural worlds. Golomb peppers his narrative full of asides, for example, illustrations depicting the proper appearance of an aquarium, and footnotes describing the root systems of true water plants versus plants that simply grow near bodies of water. It is only in the final chapter of this text that Golomb slips fully into his Lehrer voice, laughing at his childhood fantasies and ignorance, and proceeding to straightforwardly explain to the reader how fresh frogs and jabas toads reproduce. That is, they lay roigen, or roe or fish eggs, which hatch a special type of fish known as fresh keplach, or tadpoles, which then metamorphose into adult amphibians. The all-important vocabulary lesson here in Wie von a Fisch is left to the very end, unlike Das erste Mal, where it is peppered throughout the text. So I want to read the pond, again, a sort of liminal space, wild space which inhabits the middle of the shtetl, as a sort of laboratory. That is, the boys may not understand what they are looking at. Nevertheless, they have set their experimental parameters, made their astute observations, even if they have arrived at some thoroughly outrageous conclusions. So the pond and the woods are thus both wild spaces, which limn Berl and Eltzig's understanding of the world through a boyhood system of shtetl knowledge, and yet which, precisely because of this liminality, give Berl and Eltzig access to knowledge beyond their ken. I want to thus return to the question of memoir, and why I think it is still worthwhile taking Golomb seriously when he asks us to read these texts as Zichronis von seiner Kindheit. As Philippe Lejeune argues in his classic definition of autobiography, while it is essential that the narrator, author, and protagonist of an autobiography are one and the same person, and despite the doubts I expressed earlier, I don't think we are given sufficient reason to doubt the general identity between young Berl and adult Golomb. What is really significant in one's writing of the self is rather the, quote, development of the narrator's personality. And this is precisely what Golomb does for his reader in Wie von a Fisch in Das erste Mal. In each setting and in each text, he outlines the development of his personality, specifically those elements which are relevant to the pursuit of scientific understanding, such that they might serve as a model for his readers. The woods set the stage for a receptive attitude towards knowledge systems beyond one's own, and to a cross-cultural humanistic understanding of ecology. The pond becomes a receptacle for an experimental attitude, a curiosity to explore that which one does not fully understand, even when it may seem frightening or, more importantly, transgressive. What is primarily being modeled and taught throughout these texts is thus a new form of comportment to the natural world, a curiosity and openness which initiates and later motivates secular scientific understanding. And yet, in both texts, these scientific attitudes are embedded in a thoroughly Jewish context. From Berl and Eltzig's initial religio-folkloric conceptualizations of the wonderful and unfamiliar creatures and plants they encounter, as we saw above, to their responses when they are overcome with fear at the unknown. In Das erste Mal in Wald, after encountering a blood-chilling badger, Eltzig suggests that the boys head back to the shul to bench goimel, that is, the brocha reserved for when one escapes from a particularly dangerous situation. In Wie von a Fisch, the boys daven the Shema fervently and loudly before even attempting to remove the terrifying frog from the Bes Midrash attic and release it back into the pond. His texts are thus a sort of microcosmic narrative of his boyhood experience caught between the Bes Midrash interior and the great outdoors, at the precipice of tradition and modernity, a turning point which Miri Medell argues is frequently the defining conflict in Yiddish children's literature, yet which is rarely, if ever, a clean break. She writes, the corpus of children's literature, in Yiddish that is quintessentially in between. To be sure, we could read these moments as Golomb parodying his own boyhood ignorance, working through this in-betweenness to come out on the side of secular modernity. And yet I want to hold that the fluency with which this Jewish understanding of the world is textually interwoven with the secular scientific attitudes that he is modeling suggests that rather than read into them a dogmatic displacement of the Gemara by the textbook, we embrace the text as constitutively liminal, like their settings, and ambiguous, like their form. Later in his career, Golomb will go on to formalize this intertwining of religious tradition and secular modernity into a theoretical principle, advocating for a certain Yiddish-Jewish secular maximalism that he calls integrale Yiddishkeit, or integral Jewishness. Golomb's integrale Yiddishkeit calls for the grappling with the full heritage of religious tradition and secular modernity, and adhering to, quote, a summary of everything that the Jewish people has created in the course of its history, every object and every idea from Abraham down to us and beyond, and to do so in a uniquely or authentically Jewish manner. An easy task, I think. Das erste Mal in Wald and Wie von a Fisch is a Frosch geworden follow in Golomb's longstanding practice of integrating tradition and modernity, religious interiority and secular humanistic exteriority, the Bes Midrash, the forest, and the pond. In a sense, then, following in the multimillennia history of Jewish learning, these are very much books to be studied. And yet, in reading them, the reader is encouraged to put them into practice, take the vocabulary which Golomb introduces and the scientific humanistic attitudes which he models, and to go out, get dirty, and play in the mud. They are also books with whose help one studies nature. So ambiguous as they may be, they slot naturally into the broader curriculum of nature education and concomitant textual materials with which Golomb concerned himself in the 10s and 20s of the previous century. These books for Golomb, maximally Jewish, maximally secular, and it should go without saying, maximally Yiddish are precisely the sorts of books that Jewish children ought to be reading. Thank you.
So I'd also like to thank Ana Elena Torres and all of the organizers and the administrative, the tech help, as well as Jessica Kirzane for stepping in as the chair of this session. I'm very pleased to be here. So now from the shtetl to the stott for a few minutes, okay. So I'm going to be focusing on the stott, the city, and the question of urban development using as a case study Vilna, as I'll get to in a second. But to kind of open the talk, I'd like to remark that when we think of the most important sites of Jewish culture in the context of the cities of Eastern Europe, whether as scholars or whether just perhaps as tourists, visiting historic sites, we usually think of the traditional Jewish neighborhoods near the urban core. And in fact, much of the scholarship on Yiddish culture focuses on urban centers as hubs of intellectual ferment and cultural exchange. But as cities expanded, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which of course coincided with a great expansion of modern Yiddish theater, literature, culture, press, etc. In fact, many Jews left these quintessential inner city neighborhoods as the cities expanded. So as Yiddish activists expanded their work, they also turned to newly developing districts on the outskirts of cities. In addition to offering more space, these neighborhoods often had the added advantages of abundant greenery, fresh air, and access to nature. So many of these outlying neighborhoods became home to modern Jewish institutions that were set among natural features that underscored the innovative quality of the work that they were undertaking. Such features were especially valued by organizations that sought to improve Jewish health, both physical and psychological. And I'll also argue today that these institutions and their setting reinforced the founders' commitment to Doikeyt, this concept that Mindel Cohen introduced us to this morning, the sense of Jews belonging in the local landscape. So I would argue that close interaction with the natural environment that these settings enabled became a central part of the new culture that their founders wished to build. So as my title suggests, I'm going to try to explore these ideas today by focusing on the urban development of the city of Vilna. But before I get to Vilna, I'd like to start with a different city that you might not be expecting, and that is Chicago. So beginning in the mid-19th century, many cities in the United States, as in Europe, were experiencing massive growth due to industrialization, and in the American case, particularly due to mass immigration. And so to study this new phenomenon of these rapidly expanding large cities, scholars at the University of Chicago developed new techniques, largely in the emerging discipline of sociology. So these included scholars like William Thomas, who pioneered the idea of collecting life stories of ordinary individuals to use as source material, which of course that practice was adopted by Max Reinreich in the 1930s in the work of YIVO's Division of Youth Research, something that Ken Moss, who unfortunately isn't with us physically, but perhaps online because he's not feeling well, has analyzed recently in his study of the late interwar Polish Jewish community. What I'm going to focus on for my purposes today is another innovation of the Chicago School of Sociology, the use of mapping by scholars such as Ernest Burgess to discuss, to create models of urban growth in the case of concentric zones. So, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to quickly sort of walk you through how this model worked, you can see that Burgess and other scholars at the University of Chicago discussed the development of the city, in this case, using Chicago as the model, in terms of concentric rings. All right, so the innermost zone, as you can see, is labeled a slum. This was the poorest and densest and oldest housing where the poorest residents resided. And then surrounding these is a second zone that's labeled zone of working men's homes, or the two flat area. In other words, multifamily dwellings housing members of the working class. And if you continue outward, you come to the residential zone, okay, which contains apartment houses and is also labeled bright light area. And then this is followed by single family dwellings and bungalows in the outermost zone. So without, needing to know all of the details of the model, right, the idea here is that as one moves away from the urban core outwards, one moves from older to newer, more modern housing, one moves from overcrowded conditions, right, denser conditions to less density, and from mixed use to purely residential areas. Now, in a classic article on interwar Vilna, the economic historian Arkadiusz Kahan describes the growth of that city in terms of three concentric rings. Now, it may not be a coincidence that Kahan, who was a native of Vilna, the son of the Bundesleader Berg, also later emigrated to the United States and taught here at the University of Chicago. So that may have something to do with the fact that he discusses this model of three concentric rings in his discussion of the growth of Vilna. So, which I've tried to apply. This is my attempt to apply this to the map of Vilna. But in Kahn's description, there's an innermost ring that contains the so-called Old Town, the historic heart of the city, and also the Jewish quarter, the area where Jews first settled. This was the area that is well known as the historic heart of religious and communal life, marked by narrow winding streets and centered around the Schulhof, or the synagogue courtyard. And in addition to these well-known sort of symbols of traditional Vilna, it was also the area where the majority of the Jewish population lived, and it served as a commercial district for Jewish merchants, as well as people from of all backgrounds in the city who came there to shop. So even into the interwar period, this area continued to house about half of Vilna's Jews and the most venerated religious institutions and traditional institutions like the Great Synagogue and the other ploys in the small study halls in the and prayer rooms in the Jewish quarter. But over time, it became increasingly mired in poverty, increasingly overcrowded and unsanitary. In other words, it would fit Burgess's definition of a slum. So as Vilna's population grew rapidly in the late 19th century, as the population grew, the city also expanded physically to accommodate this growth. So newer districts developed around the Old Town, sometimes referred to as the New Town, and these correspond to Kahan's second ring of urban development. So as you can see in this map, because of the geography of Vilna, most of the development of the second newer ring took place to the west and to the kind of southwest of the city, because on the north and the northeast you have rivers and hilly areas. So this area, which was sometimes referred to as the New Town, or sometimes referred to after one of its main streets as Pollin-Galay, which is labeled on this map. By the 1880s, this area was laid out in broader, larger streets. And then over time, by the early 20th century, this became progressively, over several decades, built up with newer apartment buildings, large apartment buildings in what were then fashionable architectural styles. And also this area also featured more modern kinds of infrastructure. So you think about the Chicago map that had an area labeled bright light area, right? An area with like modern lighting. So these features, along with the broader streets, as well as the still undeveloped area, created a more modern environment with more open space that clearly contrasted to the urban core, which by this period was quite, as I've said, quite run down and congested. So these newer neighborhoods in the second ring attracted middle-class residents, including successful merchants, white-collar professionals, intelligentsia, and this included many Jewish residents looking for better quality housing than they could find in the older part of the city, as well as many of the institutions that they supported. So this building, for example, on this main thoroughfare in this newer neighborhood, it's called Great Pollin-Galay Street in the interwar period, was both the home of Max Weinreich, the founders of YIVO, and also the location of the first offices of YIVO. And then eventually nearby, YIVO established its headquarters, built a plot of land with open space in front of an existing wooden building, which it renovated to serve as its headquarters. Now, I've spoken about YIVO and its headquarters many, many times. I don't want to, I just want to briefly refer to it here in this context, and again, stress how the kind of novelty of the setting of the YIVO building, surrounded by trees, with landscaping, and with open space separating the building from the street, was often remarked upon for the clear contrast that it presented to the older institutions of the Jewish quarter, and how that highlighted the innovative nature of the work being carried out in what was seen to be a modern institution with a modern orientation. Another example of this was nearby school, the Mefitze Haskola School, that described its, quote, sunny, roomy, and airy classrooms, which it contrasted with the, quote, crowded, stale, and dusty streets of the city center. Okay. In addition, other institutions made their home in this kind of second zone, taking advantage of the healthful environment presented by the open space and the more abundant greenery that they found an advantage in a not just a symbolic way as a symbol of the kind of freshness of and innovative quality of their work, but in terms of actual physical health. So organizations like TOS, the Public Health Organization, or the Maccabi Sports Club took advantage of the open space, right? In this case, to use as a playing field. So just as YIVO's work, as I mentioned, particular work like Weinreich's work with the Division of Youth Research saw itself as strengthening the psychological health of young Jews. Organizations like TOS and Maccabi promoted physical health through physical exercise that was possible in large part because of their location in this second zone of the new town, which allowed them a more healthful environment and more direct interaction with nature. Now, if we come back to this map and we continue with Kahn's brief remarks about the three circles, the three zones, we see this third sort of concentric zone, the largest one that I've tried to draw here. Kahan described this third zone as typified by isolated outlying settlements, usually settlements that began as kind of independent villages. These are usually referred to in Yiddish as Vorstädtler, which is then translated as suburbs, but it's really very different from what we think of as an American suburb. Okay. But here I would also say there's the most differences from the Chicago model, the Chicago school model, where residents' class and affluence increases with distance from the city center, In the European case, this was often more, these areas were often had the most varied residents and the most varied types of uses. They usually house primarily poor working class residents, majority non-Jewish, often with simple wooden structures. Sometimes farms were located in this zone. And then by the late 19th century, they were often joined by factories that were built where there was urban space available, although this wasn't really the case in Vilna because industrialization was not very well developed there. On the other hand, these districts also served other kinds of functions that took advantage of their relative isolation and their setting among nature. On the one hand, they could become the settings of illicit underworld activity, the sex trade, illegal political movements. Most of us are familiar with descriptions of organizations like the Bund meeting in the outskirts, in the woods outside of cities, at the time when such meetings were illegal in order to avoid detection. On the other hand, affluent residents sometimes built their dachas, their like country homes in these outlying areas. And those who couldn't afford to have, homes in these areas might make day trips from the downtown area, from the more central areas, to enjoy a day of recreation among the open fields, the rivers, the forests, and the other natural features of this zone. So by the interwar period, these kinds of recreational activities took on new meanings for Jewish residents. I've already mentioned how sports clubs such as Maccabi organized various kinds of activities, including excursions to enjoy swimming, hiking, bicycling, a variety of sports. And I've already mentioned that such activities were seen as a means of promoting both physical and psychological health. Moreover, some sports clubs like the Bundes sports organization Morgenstern were explicitly connected to modern Jewish political movement. So in these cases, an outing into nature could, in addition to fostering a sense of promoting health, also fostering a sense of camaraderie, also promoting kind of shared commitment to a particular political cause. So in this sense, they also reinforce the role of political movements in creating a complete social world that filled communal and cultural functions for their members. And then to come back to this concept of Doikeyt, we could argue that even activities like this, even if their founders were not adherents to an explicit ideology or political movement that was somehow connected with diaspora nationalism, that this process of these excursions into nature helped reinforce the sense of their belonging in their local environments. And as Mindel Cohen already referenced Sam Kassov's work on the Landkundnish movement, which explicitly sought to engage young Polish Jews directly in the landscapes in which they lived, both the built environment and the natural environment, as a way of strengthening their sense of rootedness and demonstrating their rightful place among non-Jewish residents in these environments. So in this case, actually hiking into the woods or plunging into the river was a kind of physical manifestation of this idea of actually engaging directly with the natural environment and asserting one's roots there. Excuse me. So now I'd like to turn to a kind of unique project in this third urban zone of Vilna that I hope will illustrate further some of the themes that I've raised. And this was a set of apartment houses that were constructed as affordable housing for working class residents. So as cities grew, as I mentioned, inner city neighborhoods became more overcrowded and unsanitary. The newer neighborhoods in the second zone were designed primarily for middle-class residents. So certain reformers became increasingly concerned about a lack of good quality housing that would be affordable to the working class. So Jewish activists in Eastern Europe were among the very first to try to address this need. And in 1898, the Jewish Colonization Association decided to construct a set of modern, hygienic apartments in Vilna. And these buildings were known in Yiddish as colloquially as the billige Häuser, or the cheap houses, the affordable houses. This project in Vilna was actually inspired by an earlier project in Warsaw that was funded by the Jewish banker and philanthropist Hippolyte Berg, who was also associated with the JCA, the Jewish Colonization Association. And so the JCA purchased a plot of land, as you can see on this map, in the kind of southeast part of the city, in an area that still featured open fields and kind of rolling hills close to the Vilenka kind of branch of the Vilna River. So an area featuring various natural features and still undeveloped. And in this area, the sponsors could undertake a much larger building project than in the congested city center, since there was open land available. And the environment was also considered healthful by reformers involved in planning what was called hygienic housing that would promote health and sanitary living conditions. So the buildings opened in the year 1900. They consisted of about 200 apartments of either one or 2 rooms with shared kitchen and toilet facilities, all designed to meet what were considered then the kind of best standards of ventilation and sanitation. And eventually the complex provided additional amenities, including a daycare center, a bathhouse, a laundry, and even an on-site clinic. And the great majority of residents in these buildings were Jewish, although there were also some Christian families who lived there. So during the First World War, when the city of Vilna was occupied successively many times by different invading armies, the need for relief activities soared, and many local residents fled during the wartime conditions and the ensuing hunger. And so as Jewish communal activists tried to meet this need by expanding their work, they turned to locales in this third outlying zone where more space was available. So as many residents fled the cheap houses, these buildings during the First World War, an orphanage took over one of the buildings and provided housing for 300 children using the open courtyard area as a play area. The remote location of the cheap houses also offered other unanticipated advantages, such as privacy for unsanctioned activity. So just as the Bund had held illegal political meetings in remote areas of the city, one Bundist activist ran an illegal printing press in his apartment, which he found convenient because there were no neighbors who could look in the windows since there were no neighbors. So, so he felt it was less of a risk of detection for his illegal activity. And finally, in the interwar period, as modern Yiddish culture flourished in Vilna, the city became the center of, among other things, the Yiddish secular school movement. And young people came from all over the region to study at the Yiddish Teacher Seminary in Vilna to train as future instructors in these schools. So in order to provide these future teachers in training with suitable housing, in 1922, the seminary rented a block of rooms on the top floor of one of the buildings of the cheap houses to serve as a dormitory, housing between 50 and 100 young people with sleeping rooms, a kitchen, and other facilities. So students later fondly recall their life in the dormitory as a commune and an interconnected family where residents jointly made decisions about budgeting and shared household chores. One wrote, quote, "They went hungry together with gusto, were cheerful, hoped for better things, and studied with truly exceptional zeal." So despite their poverty, these young people were united by their shared goal, quote, "the fervent desire to serve Yiddish culture." So while a sports club might promote kind of social bonding during a day's outing into nature, here, these young people were living together and their daily living environment and routine kind of reinforced their ideological commitment to Yiddish culture. The physical form and siting of the dormitory building itself played a key role in shaping the experiences of these aspiring teachers. The open land around the buildings created a conducive environment for enjoying the landscape amid their studies. So one wrote in a memoir, quote, "In the summer, the dormitory is a dacha. The courtyard is overgrown with chestnut trees. Near the dorm are our heavenly hills, Gan Eden Berglach. There we study, read, and sunbathe under the sun." Those students didn't necessarily appreciate it when they had to form a human chain to carry wood or coal up to their 5th floor rooms in the dormitory for heating, but this was compensated for by the vistas from their top floor windows. And here's another quote from this memoir. "In the evening, as we look down through the window from one side, light streams in from the sunset with all of its colors that scatter in the sky. On the other side of the ridge, the woods in Belmont, the neighborhood to the east, are already darkening against the backdrop of the sandy slope on the shores of the Vilenka River." So in this description, the poor living conditions in the dormitory are forgotten amid this kind of idyllic scene of natural beauty. And similarly, it was no pleasure for the students to have to rush to classes 2 kilometers in the early morning to get to the seminary premises in the city center, especially in the winter, because the roads were still unpaved in the interwar period and became a muddy mess. But in other seasons, this trip of 2 kilometers was something they look forward to. Quote, "The dorm is a bit far from the seminary, a half-hour's walk. In the winter, we are never late to class because of this. Summer is different. We get up at dawn, leave a little earlier, walk deliberately through the little streets by the Vilenka River. We pass the gardens and still arrive at the seminary early." So here in this description, this commute becomes almost meditative. It gives the students time to experience the natural environment to prepare for the day ahead. And so the setting of the cheap houses not only promoted physical health and camaraderie through communal living, it also wove appreciation of nature into the daily experience of the residents. They came to Vilna to train for careers in Yiddish pedagogy, and their immersion in nature seems to have reinforced their immersion in Yiddish culture. So I realized I went over, I apologize. I just was gonna sort of sum up what I've already said, but maybe I don't need to. I don't know. I'm sorry, I apologize.
Yeah, maybe one more image if you want.
Well, actually, I don't have, I don't have any more images, but I just thought, this is interesting that you can see that because of the uneven terrain and so forth, that the open land is still largely open, even today. So maybe just to sum up one sense, I would just suggest that by looking more broadly physically at the space of cities in Eastern Europe, and by looking at zones beyond the innermost core into area, we can get a fuller picture of not only the development of the cities, but also the way that nature the way nature was more available and more present in these outermost zones. We can take that into account as well. And in terms of thinking about the development of modern Jewish culture and its relationship to the natural environment.
Okay, hi, is everybody able to hear me all right?
Yes,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay, it is an interesting experience to speak to you without seeing any of you. I wish I could be looking at your pen and mirror and be there in person, but this is also a great option, and I echo everyone's praise and thanks of the day. So I'll begin. Forest Outside of Nature, Yiddish Eco-Poetry of the Holocaust. The Holocaust and the climate crisis are connected on both phenomenal and historical levels. As phenomena, each was or is a massive human-generated catastrophe. Likewise, just as the Nazi ghettos and concentration camps defied the words, legal frameworks, and imaginative templates of their day, so too do people living in the 21st century struggle to describe the new developing reality of everyday extreme fires, floods, droughts, hurricanes, food shortages, and species extinctions occurring with increased rapidity. As Teju Cole wrote in the New Yorker in January of 2025, while furious fires destroyed thousands of homes in Los Angeles, California, quote, the images of a burning Los Angeles won't last simply because our ways of seeing are inadequate to our predicament. Cole's assertion that conventions of observation and expression fall short of capturing the catastrophe at hand have clear echoes in Holocaust discourse, from Jean-François Lyotard's famous metaphor that the Holocaust was an earthquake that broke the Richter scale, to Claude Lanzmann's eschewal of archival footage in his epic and epically empty film Shoah. Beyond these memory-based or conceptual connections, there are also concrete historical links between the Nazi genocide of World War II and the contemporary climate crisis. As scholars such as Boaz Neumann, Anne Berg, and Timothy Snyder have pointed out, the Nazi project was deeply rooted in environmental beliefs and ambitions. Philosopher Eric Katz describes the relationship as follows. The genocide of European Jewry and other peoples by the Third Reich was not only obviously a domination and oppression of some humans by others, but also a conscious and planned attempt to dominate and remake both the natural world and the lived environment as a particular type of German or Aryan landscape. The aspiration to conquer Lebensraum, living space for the, quote, Aryan race, required domination over bodies and minds, as well as land, trees, and soil. Nazis perpetrated mass violence in the name of nature, committing genocide as a way to express their putatively organic superiority, deepening their connection to the earth by ridding it of human pollutants. And Nazism was not entirely a novum in this regard in European history. The trope of the quote-unquote unnatural Jew was deeply embedded in European nationalist and some strands of romantic culture. As Rochelle Millen put it, the Holocaust may be seen as the culmination of a Western cultural history and philosophy which persisted in viewing Jews as alien and foreign outside of nature and European nationalism. While these layers of connection between the Holocaust and the climate crisis are fairly well recognized, I wish to approach the ecological dynamics of the Holocaust from another angle, namely focusing on victim perspectives, specifically those of East European Jews. Reading Yiddish language poetry during or right after the war, written during or right after the war, I seek to explore how Jewish people thought and wrote about the natural environment as a result of their experiences of exclusion, imprisonment, displacement, loss, and survival. To put it simply, if part of the Nazi project involved purging the earth of its human waste, what did it feel like to be defined as an ecological pollutant? I'm going to be looking at poetry written by Binyomin and by Chava Rosenfarb. And Yiddish language, both of the Yiddish is it's a choice that because that's the language that I study and that I love, but I think that it's also an especially illuminating corpus through which to study this question, since the Yiddish language writings, since it represent what was defined as unnatural in this European discourse as the language of East European Städtlichen cities, Yiddish was long considered to be distant from all things biological, animal, or botanic. And so looking at the poetry of these two poets, I explore what it meant to write about nature in a language considered outside of nature under the Nazi regime and in broader European contexts, and even in some Maskilic contexts, some Jewish thinkers internalized that idea. So, Binyamin and his search for the earth. Benjamin Harshav, born Benjamin Hrushevsky, the eminent literary theorist, critic, translator, and cultural historian, was born in 1928, began his intellectual career as a teenage Yiddish poet. He was a flight survivor who found refuge in the unoccupied Soviet Union during the war and tried to make sense of his loss and displacement by composing verse, often both about the natural world and his own experiences simultaneously. Hrushevsky was born in Vilna in 1928 and grew up in the heart of the city's vibrant secular Yiddishist culture, and he was in some of those buildings that Cecile just showed us in her presentation. The Hrushevsky family fled from Vilna to the unoccupied Soviet Union on June 23rd, 1941, just one day after the German invasion. Following a harrowing eastward journey, which included separation and moments of great danger for young Binyamin, the Hrushevsky family eventually found safe refuge in Verkhnaya Veskova in the Orenburg steppe, not far from the border of Kazakhstan. There, as a teenage refugee, piecing together bits of news that he received in the Soviet press about the destruction of his hometown, Binyamin began to write poetry, which he then later published in 1947 in Munich as a collection called Stäuben, Dust. And he signed this initial book of poetry just Binyamin, even though later he changed his Yiddish pen name to Hey Binyamin. In Stäuben, in Dust, Binyamin's earliest poem is called Ovent in Steppe, Evening on the Steppe, which he wrote in the summer of 1944. In it, Binyamin struggles with the dissonance between the beautiful landscape that surrounds him in the steppe and the destroyed landscape of Vilna, from which he had barely escaped personally and which remained front and center in his consciousness. At the same time that Binyamin was receiving news from the Soviet Yiddish press about his Jewish community's erasure, and the Soviet Yiddish press did report on the destruction of Vilna quite explicitly, and Binyamin, that is, in the persona of Harshav, does say that he read the Soviet Yiddish press at the time, so he was aware of these facts, but facts, knowing and understanding are different things. So he got the knowledge about the destruction of Vilna. At the same time, he was also receiving instructions from the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee and other Jewish leaders in the Soviet Union at the time about how to process this information of catastrophe. And one of the themes that came up in the press at the time was a kind of geographic and landscape reorientation. So part of the instructions about how to cope with the news that Vilna has been destroyed had to do with landscape. For example, in 1943, the Soviet Yiddish writer David Bergelson calls out to all Yiddish writers to take, quote, colossal steps in order to adapt their literature to the changing realities of wartime. As he put it, our classical literature, with all of its greatness and depth, only traveled between Tunyadovka and Glupsk, between Boiberik and Yechupets. These are, of course, satirical names of cities from the classic Yiddish writers. Using these satiric names, Bergelson depicts pre-war classic Yiddish literature as spatially and thus also spiritually confined by these urban and semi-urban spaces. By contrast, the war demanded a new Yiddish idiom appropriate for fighters on the front, as well as for Jews now, quote, living in Siberia as fishermen and even as hunters. Thus, as part of his plan for Jewish reinvention and heroism, Bergelson was instructing refugees like young Binyamin to embed themselves in the landscape around them, to seek strength and renewal by teaching themselves to live off the land, to speak and write in Yiddish about a new earthbound lifestyle in the Russian hinterlands. In the first poem, in the first stanza of the poem, Oven in Steppe, Binyamin tempts us to believe that he is playing by Bergelson's rules of environmental resilience, drawing Yiddish closer to the earthly landscape of the Orenburg steppe. In the clean and clear of the quiet eve, when the mild wind offers her caresses to the king of the steppe, that soft down quilt that covers the steppe with grayish feather grasses. And here, feather grasses is a word that I've translated from kovil. And the word kovil is key to this stanza. It stands out. It's not in any Yiddish dictionary, according to those that I found then or now. And Harshav actually glosses it as a word that he purposefully took from Russian. And it means a kind of feather grass that's local, that's indigenous to the Orenburg steppe. So that word, if we're just taking this stanza at face value, it signals that the poet is incorporating a new language and a new landscape, simultaneously letting go of the urban Jewish life of Vilna that was no more and moving on to embed himself in the Russian wilderness, just as Bergelson had instructed. The poem extends this pastoral description for a while longer, and even at times plays very close to the borders of cliché. But, however, then Binyamin inserts himself on the scene as a lone observer who senses that beyond the quiet green horizon of the Orenburg steppe, there is another kind of open, empty space in Vilna, the place where his life first dawned, in the words of the poet. It's quiet there too, in the kingdom of death, where a youth song once split open the sky, where a people had long built its life, and now a cold wind dances alone through piles of scrap, of bricks, of stones, and leftover human bones. Vilna has been flattened into a field. It's been made into a kind of steppe, not by progress or revolution, but by regressive and pointless human violence. In the map of the poem, the two landscapes or the two fields collide like tectonic plates, two territories containing opposite types of quiet, one pastoral and one deadly, one containing a promise of new Jewish rootedness and one the rubble of hundreds of years of Jewish civilization laid to waste. Binyamin cannot interact with the more than human world before him on the steppe, the grasses, the topography, the weather, the water, without confronting this collision. At the end of the poem, Binyamin spells out the implications of this realization. Von meine glühendicke Augen Tränen ich treib, in mir gefielen wären, wie Bartog die Stern, verloschen, nicht bleib, unlöschen. All feelings are extinguished, but so is language itself. In Yiddish, the rhyme emphasizes this message, verloschen, unlöschen, his words extinguished. The poetic I will nonetheless survive, albeit in an incomplete form. Only a contracted part of the word for I moves forward on this refugee journey. In the end, Binyamin cannot embed himself in the grasses and breeze of the steppe as much as he would like to. He needs an honest language, one that includes his community's story of catastrophe, in order to speak of himself and the earth in one sentence. Around the time that Binyamin was writing these Stoiben, dust poems, another youthful Jewish survivor was sitting in cafes in Brussels, recovering from typhus, having just been liberated from Bergen-Belsen. She was in Auschwitz previously, and trying to capture the contradictions of her first moments of freedom, Dafka, by writing a ballad about trees. This is Chava Rosenfarb. Before the war, Rosenfarb was raised in a socialist Yiddishist milieu in Łódź, where she completed her primary education in the Bundist Medim school. Though passionate about literature before the war, Rosenfarb became a committed poet only in the ghetto. When Rosenfarb was deported to Auschwitz with her family in August 1944, her ghetto poems were confiscated and thrown in the trash. In 1945, Rosenfarb and her mother found refuge in Belgium, where she began to reconstruct her lost lyrics while also writing new poetry and beginning a massive narrative undertaking that would eventually become the 3-volume trilogy Der Boom von Leben, written over the course of nearly 3 decades. The Tree of Life. Notice, trees once again. Rosenfarb's first published poem, so going back to that first poem she wrote when she was right out of Bergen-Belsen, when she was 23 years old, was titled Die Ballade von Nächtlichen Wald. And by the way, I'm going to speak about material trees as material realities and as metaphors, but just to underscore how important these trees were in a material way, there is a wonderful photographer named Maciek Zich who's done a photo essay on Lodz Ghetto trees, all of the trees that survived or grew in the space that was the Lodz Ghetto. And so it's an interesting visual connection there. So, Die Ballade von Nächtlichen Wald, published in New York in Zukunft. She called the poem a ballad, and this invites this importantly invites a direct conversation with romantic poems and romantic poets, many of whom revisited the balladic form as a way of uplifting their national folk arts. One likely point of reference for Rosenfarb would have been Poland's romanticist Adam Mickiewicz, especially his epic Pan Tadeusz, which even features a family wedding of trees. Writing her own arboreal ballad, it is as if Rosenfarb is asking if she, a landless refugee who had lost her home in Poland, and lost is a euphemism, could somehow claim this genre for her own. Thus, the awkward fit between romanticism and its Nazi interpretation in the form of new romanticism, with its combination of racism and love of nature, and Jewish Holocaust nature poetry. This awkward fit is thus announced in Rosenfarb's title. The poem is 74 verses in total. I'm not going to discuss all of them, as you can imagine, and it progresses through roughly 4 different phases, the first of which sketches the scene of a destroyed forest. Nächten in Wald is a Schrefe gewesen, heint is das Feld noch ein Sturm, wo es hoben Nächten bei mir gelebt, stehen no seine Quorum. At first, depicting only trees, weather, and topography, there are no humans explicitly on this scene, the evocation of tree graves then introduces a subtle human overlay. Rather than an expression of pat anthropomorphism, however, this image of tree graves, Quorum, poses several challenging questions. Why aren't there typically any cultural rituals like grave markings to recognize the loss of trees or other elements of the biosphere, at least not in the Western cultures that would have been familiar to Rosenfarb? That is, why is tree graves a ridiculous phrase to begin with? Conversely, while we usually assume that human death will be marked with graves or urns or memorial plaques of some kind, this was in fact not the case for most Holocaust victims, including Rosenfarb's family and community, whose bodies were either tossed into pits or incinerated at camps. The Nazis made Jewish death and the death of others deemed outside of their notion of humanity more like tree death, anonymous, forgettable. She's calling upon a similarity between trees and Jews in this moment, but at least for now, that is not a virtue or a positive thing, since both deserve more recognition and care than they are receiving in this moment. So this stanza with its tree graves reference is not a mere instrumentalization of nature for the sake of telling her human story. Rather, this early image of tree graves invites us to challenge social conventions around marking death, determining whose matters and whose does not. Similarly, the second stanza poses yet another challenge to discussing botanic human relations and belies simplistic binaries of anthropocentrism versus biocentrism. Repeating the opening refrain, yesterday a fire came to the forest, the stanza depicts smoldering hollows of wood standing in the place of, quote, yesterday's trunks, Geviksn Stammen. As with tree graves, the image of interrupted tree trunks, stems invites a human analogy onto the scene, especially because Stamm in Yiddish also means origin. So it can be the Jewish origin, or the Jewish origin story has been cut off midway by the Nazi genocide. But this is also much, much more than a metaphor. If we go back to the path-breaking literary and linguistic work of Lakoff and Johnson, to stem from somewhere, stammen von irgendwo, stammen von etwas, is a metaphor to live by, and that crosses many different cultures. It's not merely a symbol. Stams, to stem from something, is a crucial ontological concept that depends on humans seeing a continuum between their own biological life and spiritual life as well, and that of plants. What is more, depicting a human community, a nation to be specific, as an organic entity that had roots, stems, and limbs was key to Nazi ideology and rhetoric. The concept of the Volksgemeinschaft, a racially unified people's community, relied quite often on the term Stamm in many different forms. So here's just one example from the Nationalsozialistische Monatshefte from 1936, where this is a review of a book review. They're saying that the beauty of this poetry that this poet writes is that he touches upon the organic life paths of Stamm, Volk, Rasse, origin, people, race. So Stamm was, for any European would have heard this, a Nazi phrase through which they claimed a monopoly on the connection between earth, biology, and human culture. So in using this term Stamm in her poem, 23-year-old Chava Rosenfarb is reclaiming the means of earthly connection for her own purposes and taking it away from the Nazis in an experimental way. Having set the scene of the destroyed forest and established a bidirectional relationship between people and trees, the poem then shifts into a fable-like plot that took place before the forest fire, a love story between an oak and a pine, perhaps in reference to explorations of Polish-Jewish intermarriage in the interwar years. Yet, before the oak and the pine are able to explore the risks and beauties of their illicit love, Rosenfarb interrupts their love story by re-narrating the forest fire, this time with much more violence and totality. The fire kills off every single world it meets. Rabbits and deer face rings of fire. The babbling spring is slaughtered. Tree corpses lay their heads on the ash, and the forest becomes forgotten in all worlds. After having been momentarily immersed in the sense of contingency and openness and experimentation with which Rosenfarb depicted the interwar years via tree love, tree romance, we can now appreciate the death of the forest, or the Jewish people, of the future pathways, and all of the possibilities, the potentialities that were cut off with it even more. With this forceful re-narration of the forest destruction, it is as if Rosenfarb is not only jolting her readers out of a dreamlike reminiscence of better times, but also waking herself up too, as if she suddenly realized that she could not, in fact, rely fully on the conventions of European nature poetry to write about herself as a survivor. She can play with the balladic nature form, experiment in its joys, but ultimately must breach the genre and its assumptions of cyclical rejuvenation in order to tell an authentic story about herself, her community, and their catastrophe. Near the end of the poem, we hear the voice of the pine's dead father, which sounds a lot like Rosenfarb's dead father, Avrom Rosenfarb. advising her to embrace ecological collaboration as an antidote to the Nazi destruction/forest fire. Let those grasses prepare the sap to nurture the scorched earth back to life. Have you any other choice, my child? After all, you were born a pine. So he is, as the ghost of a tall tree, is telling her, as a tall, powerful tree, look down at the grasses beneath you. You actually need them to survive. And if you help those small grasses to survive, somehow your world will come back in some form, new form. To conclude, I wish to address a tension that has arisen in the currently expanding field of the environmental Holocaust studies, that between a new biocentric approach to the field, articulated by scholars such as Eva Domanska and Jacek Małczyński, who argue that, quote, the environmental history of the Holocaust makes it possible to transcend the anthropocentric perspectives that dominate discourse on the Shoah. Until now, the history of the Holocaust has been a human history. Now, I have no idea. I can't read the room because I'm not there, but I don't know about y'all, but I read the last sentence and I think, yeah, that's okay. The history of the Holocaust has been a human history. Yeah, those were humans that were killed there, and there were humans that did it. So it's, okay. There's their suggestion. Others have been uncomfortable with this, like Omer Bartov, who fired back at Domanska and the killing sites are remarkable less for their limited environmental impact and more for their unique feature as black holes that sucked and eradicated an entire human civilization. What I believe that Benjamin and Rosenfarb show in their work is that the binary between biocentrism and anthropocentrism is a false one. It's not plausible or especially valuable to try to isolate non-human nature from the people impacted by it in the Holocaust or the people who caused this event to come about. At the same time, some of the human subjects victimized by the Holocaust and thus worthy of our attention without a doubt, they themselves saw who they were, their rights and their stories as deeply entwined with the more than human sphere, the plant world especially. Their wish to be earthly subjects was a critical aspect of their emic, of their self-definition of survival and recovery. For refugees like Rosenfarb and Benjamin, finding the physical, verbal, and political means to be earthly was not an easy task. Thank you.
I have a few thoughts of my own, but I also don't want to take up too much space. So if other people, Mindel, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, thank you all, like, wonderful papers that I have lots of notes on. Maybe I'll start, Hannah, with a question for you that, you know, it strikes me that Bergelson's call is rhetorical to some degree, right? He has to be ignoring works of the Yiddish literature that he knows that engage with broader territories and landscapes. And maybe more importantly, that call is ignoring works that Harshav certainly knows that engage with broader landscapes, like toolbox poetry that I was speaking about, or Sutzkever, like his other Vilna poets. So I'm just curious, I'm curious about that, which is part of what this symposium is doing, right? Is like centering these other kind of landscapes that are present in Yiddish literature beyond the kind of typical Städtlech. And maybe do you see that as part of what, is there a continuity or something for Harshav's poetry with those other landscapes that are present in Yiddish literature, but maybe not the most canonical or something?
Thank you. Shall I answer, Jessica?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
I don't think that Benjamin or Rosenfarb started from scratch. They were both certainly reading a lot, like Golomb, or, you know, they're reading a lot about Yiddish nature in Yiddish and so forth. But you know, first of all, this was also relatively new, and there's a sense that even at those times that this was an experimentation, and it went against the tide of the larger you know, and longer discourse of the unnatural Jew. So in that sense, you know, they had experiences of the plant world, and they had experiences reading about the plant world, but they also had a very dominant discourse, rhetoric around them that said, yeah, that doesn't actually belong to you. That's not actually who you are. And so who knows if there hadn't been World War II and the Holocaust and TOS and the teacher's seminar and the Landkenntnis had just kept going, maybe they would have been so deeply entrenched in Jewish culture that, you know, that would not have felt like a risky endeavor to try to be earthly. But as it stands, that was a contingency that that had to fight against a lot of very dominant rhetoric that went in the other direction.
Yeah.
All right, well, I too love these papers and have many questions, but I just have a simple question. This is for both Caleb and for Hannah. And it's about simply the fact that so many of these words for three types come from Russian, or from, I think, Sosne, Dembe, etc. And this interesting example, Hannah, that you bring in of the Kovil, right? So these texts, even if they're poetic or if they're memoir, you know, textbooks, they have some kind of a pedagogical element insofar as they're introducing terminology. And I'm just curious what you guys make of the fact that that component of Yiddish is coming so much from the Russian and the Slavic when we're learning to talk about the environment in more specific, rigorous taxonomic terms, when we're becoming, like, you know, in English, we might use more Latinated terms at that moment. And so the Latin component is something, or, you know, so I don't have enough of an ear, obviously, for, as a non-native Yiddish speaker, for how that sits. But Hannah, you were actually saying that this term is not in any dictionaries. It was, you know, so if you could both, I don't know, sort of reflect on that, how Yiddish is affected by the introduction of those specific terms, not biblical terms, not Aramaic terms that are so.
Yeah, I can start us off. So one caveat I always like to give about Golomb when I talk about him is that he is a deeply polemical writer. This man is not afraid to say things that are totally out of pocket sometimes and not at all justify his opinions, which is kind of what I like about him. It's what drew me to him in the first place. I sort of, you know, when first introduced him, I kind of like to meet him at his level, but this is all by way of introduction to say that, you know, for example, as you're pointing out, a lot of these words do come from, say, Russian or Polish or other Slavic components of the Yiddish language. Golomb, must be noted, was a native Russian speaker. He actually started writing in Russian primarily before he moved to writing in Yiddish, became an active Yiddishist. You know, I didn't show any of the examples, but most of the footnotes, again, weird that there are footnotes in a children's book, but besides the point, in Das erste Mal in Wald are when he anticipates that a Yiddish reader will not recognize the name for a plant he's given, he footnotes it with the same name in Cyrillic, so implying, of course, that he's borrowed it from Russian. And then, you know, the other thing I just wanted to say, so, you know, he says that he's taking these terms from the Volkssprache as if there's kind of some kind of Ur-Yiddish source from which he's drawing all this language. And then, to which I didn't mention, he adds a note appended to that where he says, but where that wasn't possible, I borrowed terms from Russian and German and I Yiddishized them. What's the difference, right? What's the difference between something that comes from the Volkssprache and what is a, you know, a Yiddishized Russian or German term? I'm not a linguist, I don't want to actually speculate, but I think it's interesting that he sort of divides those two up. Just, you know, one other example that's coming to mind is just that I found is a real striking one. On a similar note, Hannah, to how you mentioned that you couldn't find Kovil in any dictionary. One of the terms for tree, one of the trees that Golomb gives us in his text is a Hashonaboim, which I looked up. I'd never encountered this word before. I couldn't find it in any of the dictionaries, only figured out what it was by consulting his Geviksn Wörterbuch, which has a glossary at the back comparing all of the Yiddish terms to an equivalent Russian term, by which I figured out that it is a willow tree, which is typically in Yiddish a Verbe, right, which is a much more Deutsch version. So, it's interesting that, where did he get this from? I've never really seen it anywhere else. I did a bit of OCR searching, couldn't really find any other references to it. He says he's consulted ethnographic work in his research. I've yet to find any proof that he actually has, but I do need to go and do a bit more archival digging on that front. So.
Hannah, do you also want to?
Yeah, I'll be brief. Well, I think that in answer perhaps to Caleb's question of what's the difference between, a Yiddish term that overlaps with another term and taking something from contemporary German or Slavic language and Yiddishizing it is time. So a word that's been in Sosne, it's in Yiddish so long, it's not really a Slavicism. It's not marked that way. Whereas Kovil, that poet actually footnotes and says, I heard this term, from Russian, and it was new to me then. So that's one thing. I think that these are all really interesting questions. I mean, the anxiety around being able to name natural entities in Yiddish, and also in Hebrew, you can go into to Mapu and to Chernichovsky and of course Mendel and Moicher Sforim, and his book on nature. It's an interesting anxiety, which I think speaks to an anxiety towards earthliness more broadly, because if you feel at home in a certain embedded space, who the hell cares if you know the names or not? It's a kind of insecurity, I think, that they turn to with all this naming. And I'm interested, and I'm interested in their anxiety about naming, of course, but I'm also interested in looking at, Jewish cultural historical encounters with, with vegetation, with the non-human world, where they're not trying to name, like Hasidic Hisboididis, where that is an encounter that hasn't been counted as an encounter because it's not agrarian. But you won't really find in that Hasidic literature, like, I was walking around and thinking about Hashem, and then I realized I didn't know the name of that tree. So I'm interested in that dynamic in several directions.
Yeah, that strikes me. One of the questions I was going to ask as well had to do with kind of the difference between like riding the magic school bus and the project that you're describing, Golomb's project, and maybe that it has to do with this kind of vocabulary development and ownership over naming, and also the kind of narrative history. I didn't know, but now I know, and I can tell you. So I wonder if you wanted to talk about that as well, the kind of like how you see it as different from other kinds of scientific educational projects in that way.
Yeah, I think this is where I'm sort of heading with it, is to think through that question a little bit more deeply. I mean, the initial thought I have is, sort of what I was trying to sketch out at the end, is just how intertwined it is with, his sort of boyhood Jewish understanding of the world, and how he is totally unwilling to let go of that in a way that I don't see quite the same sort of civilizational stakes at play in something like the Magic School Bus, right? Which Golomb is very explicit that there are, civilizational Yiddish stakes in these silly little stories he's writing, that they're not just silly little stories, nor are they also just, a text to help you learn your periodic table or something like that. There's sort of another level operating in them. But what I think is, I had a further thought to your question, but it left my mind. So if we have time, I'll come back.
Yeah.
To it, so.
I see a lot of hands, so actually I'm going to take a couple of questions and then we can address them together.
Thank you. The fascinating panel. And my question is for Hannah, and it connects to the discussion that just took place. And I was wondering whether the sort of this image of an arboreal love story, whether one precedent for it is Heine's poem about the Fichtenbaum and the pine tree and the palm, right? And that the pine tree longs for the palm in the south, and it's seen as a kind of both drawing on Goethe, but also a kind of proto-Zionist poem, right? And I guess I bring that up to wonder whether Rosenfarb's case, unlike the poem by Benjamin that you described, that there's also sort of the distance from that place, right? And that she's writing it not only in the wake of the destruction, but also away from it and without any expectation to be back there. And so this connects also with Aisha's beautiful paper from the morning, this kind of the tension between ideas of Doikeyt or of being rooted in a sort of utopian landscape or in a nationalist landscape versus the kind of the poetics of memory and reconstructing spaces in retrospect.
That's a great, I mean, I don't think I think you said it all. I think that's a really beautiful, that's a really, really beautiful connection to explore. Thank you. And I you know, and I just, I said I didn't have anything to add, but you know, Vilna disease. I'll just say this, that one of the things that I love so much about studying Yiddish women writers in particular is that, and Rosenfarb, is that who were her influences is much harder to trace and more interesting and more open, because she didn't have, you know, like a teacher and no one, you know, pegged her as like the genius next generation from the beginning. And so did she read, you know, Pantadeus? Did she read Heine? Probably, you know, but we don't have all that. So I think it's all open, and I think it's all probably there. And I'm trying to do that work too with, you know, the connection, the challenge of German Romanticism and the double-edged sword of being an inspiration and a source of exclusion for these writers is a really hard one. And how this goes through the different German poets is something I need a lot of education about, so I'm working on it.
Aisha.
I have a question for Cyril, and I hope also Shmuel. Maybe Hannah, if you have something you'd like to add. So I'm fascinated by this idea of green space. Both of your papers overlap in this way, talking about ponds and forests and thinking of them as a laboratory, either a pedagogical laboratory or a political and hygienic laboratory, even for, you know, the calisthenics and those sort of things. My question is, today we see, you know, especially in urban life, that green spaces are barred for many people. You know, having access to trees and parks and those sorts of things is somewhat of a luxury. Is that inequality also present either in the construction of the city of Vilna or in Golomb's message to, you know, Goyce and Klein? I guess my question is, who has access to these green spaces? Are we looking at a democratized green space where, you know, it's pretty open, everyone has access to this sort of education? Or is this something that actually does lie on, you know, maybe a certain boundaries of inequality?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think in the context that I'm looking at in European cities, you know, I think as I mentioned during the talk, one of the things that's interesting to me about these third zones is that you have a mixture of everyone from kind of affluent people who have their country homes there to really poor, you know, poor people. And to me, one of the key elements is, well, I mean, there's scale, right? And also transportation, you know, I mentioned infrastructure, right? But like transportation, right? So, I mean, because Vilna is a relatively small city, if you were very poor and you lived in the city center, you know, you could walk for, you know, a half hour or 45 minutes and get to an area that was forested, or, you know, get to the river and, you know, kind of enjoy nature, you know. That was more of as you get to like larger scales of cities, that's harder, right? And you know, so for example, the earlier housing projects in Warsaw that I didn't discuss, you know, were actually designed to, they actually had very few Jewish residents, even though they were sponsored by a Jewish philanthropist. You know, and I think the main problems is that, you know, for people who were working class and had to go to work every day, if you were living on the outskirts to get to the city center, if that's where your job was, if there's no public transportation, right? If it's a larger city, I mean, it's one thing to take like a long walk on a weekend because you want to go for a picnic, right? Once in a while. It's another thing if that's like you need to get to your job every day, right? So for the, you know, if you were, I don't know, the orphans that were living there on the outskirts, right? They were living there, right? But in terms of, you know, for let's say every people who, as a viable kind of daily, you know, environment for people to live in those neighborhoods, you know, until there was actually like affordable public transportation, right? I think that was a key factor in excluding, you know, excluding people from making it a kind of practical daily, you know, place where they could kind of, you know, enjoy those benefits on a daily basis, right? at least for most, for most Jewish residents of these cities, right? Because there were some cases where you had non-Jews, primarily non-Jews who were working in factories that were also located on the outskirts, right? But for most Jewish residents, they would have to travel to the city center for their jobs, right? So that distance becomes a kind of obstacle, I think.
I could also, this is great because this lets me say my other favorite thing about studying Golomb is that Golomb is the guy that all of your guys were obsessed with that you didn't know he was obsessed with and or is connected with somehow with every aspect of Yiddish culture. Cecile, I had no idea that the Lehrer Seminar in Vilna was located in this sort of exurbic environment. That is the Lehrer Seminar where Golomb was for many years the director. He, he is sort of one of the key figures of this institution. Many memoirs written later, sort of contributions to festschrifts of him are from his former students at the Lehrer Seminar, who, the sort of core memory that they have of Golomb is as this sort of jolly man who inspired in them a love of nature, precisely, which I didn't realize because of the Lehrer Seminar's situatedness next to this kind of natural environment, such that he was able to sort of run this summer school, where he would basically go out into one of these Vorstädtlach with all of his students every summer and sort of teach them, the way his students describe it, is how to listen to nature. But Aisha, just to address your question a little bit more directly, it's interesting. So I don't know really what the readership of these books would have been if there was really all that expansive of a readership. I have to imagine if there was, it was mostly urban. That is to say that the kids who would have been reading these books that Golomb was writing at the time were not necessarily the same kids as are being depicted in the narrative, right? They are not these shtetl children. They are not these children who are in this sort of liminal space between what is the sort of, metonymic heart of Jewish civilization or Ashkenazi Jewish civilization and, the natural world, which I'm leaning towards reading that as their audience, if for no other reason than Golomb, in the time he's writing this, he's situated between Vilna and Kiev primarily. He's working with all these sort of major urban institutions to promote Yiddish culture. And I think it really is like these two books, Tosar Shmuel and Bifna Fish, are his way of sort of creating a space for a sort of primordial Jewish contact with nature that the audience who's reading them didn't necessarily have access to. So is that an effective form of democratization? I don't know, it's a book. It's not, not everyone would have gone to study with Golomb at the Lehrer Seminar and follow him into the Vorstädtlach every summer to have this, brilliant, beautiful experience of nature.
I'll just say that it's interesting that one would think of not asking this about that's what a ghetto is to completely exclude Jews from nature, to limit movement and to deny the right to have contact with the natural world was one of the rights that was taken away from Jews, and constant movement and expulsion from one place to another, and the creation of a disoriented psyche in which you couldn't even locate yourself in space or in nature, even if you were physically able to, was a really important part of subjugation in the Holocaust. So it doesn't just that the story stops, it's a continuation of practices of exclusion from open green spaces in cities to an extreme degree.
I think, oh, sure, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Thank you so much to the panel. I had a question for Chana. Chana said, what does it mean to write about nature in a language considered outside of nature? And I have been thinking about what does it mean to represent disability or describe experiences of disability in Yiddish, in a language which has been constructed as a disabled language or a disabled version of German. And so I was really struck by the way that you phrase it. And if you have other thoughts kind of on this question of what does it mean to write in the language outside of nature, I'm curious if this is a question that is part of your broader project on ecologies, or how else you're thinking about it?
I'm learning. My broader project is developing in real time. So you are all really helping me with that. And I love that parallel. And I'm sorry, I know we're not bringing in like, current events, but the way that disabilities are spoken of in the United States at present, it's really a disturbing moment where it feels like in English, American English, that's happening. But I think that's a great parallel, and I think that Rosenfarb and Benjamin experiment with this. I think that it will, in a sense, like just because Rosenfarb's this is an epic, so there's more, and she kind of puts more of her heart on the line and experiments more, and doesn't back off with this kind of cynicism so quickly. I think that for her, she's going to beg, borrow, and steal any expressive means that are out there, and break them and use what she wants, get frustrated with them, let us see her frustration with them. I think that is her way of writing about nature when she's been defined as outside of nature. So I don't know if that has a parallel in disability, but maybe so, since in any case, outside of nature and having an improper body were claims that were adjacent to one another. You know, especially improper masculinity and not being able to work a farm were completely intertwined as stereotypes, as tropes about Jews. So thank you.
Thank you. These have been wonderful questions and wonderful papers, and I think really, help us understand the stakes of this conference in a really profound way, about writing about nature, being about access to health and science, and also speaking back against the idea of Yiddish or Jews as contagion. I think all of that together has been very powerful. So I really thank you for these wonderful papers and the audience questions.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks to my panelists. I hope to talk to you later.
Thanks, yeah.
Oh, it's so much to talk about. Okay.
Thank you so much to everyone who presented today. Just to let you know, for tomorrow, we will be in a different location. It will be on campus on the quad, in a building called the Social Science Research Building. The room is called the Tea Room. If you have any questions about where to find that, let me know. And we'll be starting an hour earlier tomorrow. So we'll have tea and light breakfast at 9. The next panel will start at 9:15. Tomorrow we'll have 3 panels. These will be on Ecofeminism and Gender Studies, on the Poetics of Landscape, and on Animal Studies, and concluding remarks by Dr. Kirzane. So I hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you so much.